This is the first episode of the Bug Report with Matthew Gates. I am an integrated pest management specialist. That means that I work on the IPM strategies and biosecurity measures for cultivation spaces. Today, one of the things I wanted to talk about are sort of basic understandings of IPM, the holistic perspective that I use to articulate the cultivation space at large, and some of the terms that I use that are sort of specific to me, or at least their use is specific to me. Part of that is to go over IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Perhaps the most fundamental thing to characterize is what is Integrated Pest Management. IPM means a lot of things to a lot of people. To me, it is fundamentally a holistic perspective. It has to be, because there are factors about the cultivation of plants that are sort of intrinsic, like pests and pathogens, and sort of less intrinsic because they are indirectly influenced, or they are something that people don't consider at all. For example, the market, or perhaps the economic system that somebody's cultivating under, or perhaps the resources that people have at their disposal. There are a bunch of qualities that people will categorize as variously direct or variously indirect with regards to how they influence. In my opinion, all influences are important to consider for the most part, but there are some that are more pertinent than others, and every single context is a little bit different, which is another reason why you have to look at things holistically. What is possible for one person is not necessarily possible for another person, and the same holds true for business cultures, cultivation spaces, different environments. This is not a very controversial topic, but it bears repeating. So what is biosecurity? Well, biosecurity is like physical security or digital security. It is the ability to keep things from happening, the influence of those things from a very layman or sort of generalistic outlook. Typically, we're referring to negative things, but in all honesty, security doesn't necessarily have to target only those things. Indeed, some things that we do for security aren't necessarily great because they stop beneficial things from happening, so I don't believe that the connotation of negativity is necessarily important here. Biosecurity measures and IPM strategies can essentially be boiled down to different classes. Some people are already aware of things like biological controls or biocontrols. That's the use of a living organism in order to repel or kill or compete with, or in some way discourage or disincentivize the growth of in a cultivation space. Some things do this directly by feeding on a target pest. Other things like microbial bioinsecticides or inoculants can compete with a pathogen for space or resources, or again directly feed on or negatively influence a pathogenic microbe. In other cases, they might create a circumstance where what would normally be a pathogen might not operate like a pathogen. And that is sort of the important complexity that somebody has to consider in a holistic outlook. As our understanding of the ecology of the world increases, we understand the relationships between pathogens and pests and our plants that we're trying to grow, and we understand that the interactions of all of these factors, both biotic and abiotic, so living and non-living, are incredibly complex. They're the most complex thing we know about. It is the world, after all. And as cultivation spaces are more and more mimicking the natural ecologies and considering the effects of a local climate or terrain or population and community of organisms, just as we do for the world, so too must we when it comes to integrated pest management. Some things are easier to tell than others too. One should consider that a pest that is an arthropod, or like an insect, something that is sort of macroscopic, we can see it with our own eyes unaided, or at least they're damaged in some cases. Those things are easier to identify, and those things are easier in some cases to treat. Not all, though. Microbial interactions, however, or effects on the plant, like genes or their defense signaling pathways, like a lot of pests, they are macroscopic, but their effects are microscopic. Aphids, for example, are very famous for transmitting pathogens, and so are a lot of other phloem-feeding or sap-feeding insects. They also often have the ability to alter, attenuate, or silence aspects of the plant defense pathway, which disallows the plant to ready or utilize its traits that would resist it. In some cases, this is a response to the environment on the part of the pest, and that it has adapted to a particular plant. In other cases, the defense signaling pathways themselves are very old or conserved amongst a lot of plants, so it just so happens that the pest that's good against, Fabaceae or legumes might be able to go after multiple species in the same family because the defense signaling pathways are very much shared between these species or these genera. In addition to biological controls, we also have things like chemical controls. Now, some of these chemicals that people utilize are synthesized or totally synthetic, but they are also sometimes, and especially recently, derived from botanical sources or from other natural sources like microbes, or even in some cases the biosynthesis of like venom from spiders and things like that, which can only affect certain kinds of animals, in this case arthropods, so humans aren't necessarily going to be affected if they only target the peptides of a venom that affect arthropods. This is another example of how our understanding of ecology and physiology necessarily allows us to co-opt and adapt natural remedies because we understand why they are effective, and we can find ways to tweak them or to make them even less dangerous to people and other non-target things. For example, sometimes a natural chemical like a nicotinoid, like nicotine, which is natural, comes out of tobacco plants, but it might be more effective against a pest that is not used to feeding on plants that produce it. So in that way, if you utilize it on pests that are already adapted to that class of chemical, or maybe only that specific type of chemical, then you might selectively pressure that population to adapt and become resistant, at first tolerant, then resistant, and then maybe possibly even immune, although that might not be possible in a lot of cases. It's especially not possible if you make sure to rotate the chemistry classes that you're using. In that way, you don't artificially select for resistance in a population of pests. This is a problem both for synthetic chemistries and natural chemistries. After all, it is these chemicals that are produced by the defense signal pathways of plants. There are also environmental controls. In some cultivation spaces, this is easier for people to affect than others. In an outdoor environment or a greenhouse environment, you have less control. In an indoor facility, however, you have much more control. The ability to affect the temperature and the humidity of an area, either directly or indirectly, is very helpful. And even if you can't affect the general environment, you might be able to affect the microclimate, either by affecting the spacing of plants in a cultivation area, or affecting the kinds of plants that you allow to grow in the cultivation area. These small changes can have radically large effects by, for example, allowing plants to host beneficial organisms, or to allow for certain microbes to become more abundant in the rhizosphere as well as the phyllosphere. So the rhizosphere is the place with all the roots, and the phyllosphere is where there are a lot of leaves. So the phyllosphere is everything above the soil level, and the rhizosphere is everything below it. Certain microbes will grow on some plants more than others. The interrelationship between microbes and plants is also very complex. A lot of times the relationships that mycorrhizae and rhizobia and other sorts of microbes that we consider to be beneficial have a relationship with pathogens even, and in some cases the same family of microbes will have many pathogens and also many beneficials because they descend from the same ancestor. And sometimes the way that both of them interact with the plant are pretty similar. It's just that one of them doesn't benefit the plant and the other one does. In some cases, these, what are called endophytes, or organisms that can live inside the phyte or the plant, are somewhat neutral, or they require some kind of environmental or biological trigger to have an effect one way or the other. All relationships are on sort of a gradient, and it's contextual. And this is what I mean again when I say we have to consider the cultivation space in a holistic way. You have to know the context. And the more details that you know, the better you are able to understand the greater picture. It's not necessarily the case that you cannot be successful without knowing these things, but these details are incredibly useful, and the better we understand what those details mean, the better we can make use of them. So again, we have biocontrols, chemical controls, and environmental controls, or techniques if you want to call them that. All of these things, as I've already said, already have sort of an interrelationship from an ecological standpoint. Biocontrol agents will do better in certain environments, as will pathogens. Biocontrols and pests themselves will be affected by various chemicals, both by attracting them, repelling them, or signaling some other aspect of the environment, like where prey can be found, whether an organism is sick or not already, and in that way be a suitable host. Plants also give out what are called herbivore-induced plant volatiles, or volatile organic compounds. And these leaf volatiles, some of which are terpenes, but there are also many other aromatics that plants produce, some of which we find fond because they have an interesting taste or have an effect on our bodies, also have an effect on the physiology of pests and pathogens and prey for the predators and parasites that we might utilize in order to affect those pests. In this direct example, where we have pests, pathogens, and predators and biocontrol agents, they are affected by chemicals that are coming out of the plants. They're affected by chemicals coming out of the air. They are affected by other particulates like pollen or dust or the ultraviolet radiation of the sun, as well as that of lights for those that utilize them. All of these things are happening, and so the environment, the biological aspect, and the chemical aspect, which is really just a direct kind of aspect of the environment and the biology, because the plants have to utilize the environment to produce these chemicals as an aspect of their own physiology. In a way, the chemical techniques are kind of a subset of the biological techniques, if you want to call it like that. And all of these things are going to be affected by the cultivation environment itself. One of the other aspects of IPM that I like to talk about that's also kind of encompassing is the cultural technique. The cultural technique is the technique that refers to standard operating procedure. It refers to the way that you do things. And those ways that people do things are, in a lot of cases, going to be affected by the resources of the cultivation space, such as the labor, financial resources, what the environment is like for the company. If people are really passionate, their morale, all of these things, many of which are not always easily quantifiable, but affect the implementation of other aspects of IPM, like the usage of biocontrols. Biocontrols are expensive for some and not for others. That's why the context of the company or the cultivation space is important. Most people recognize that a residential area and a commercial area are going to be entirely different. Somebody who is growing in the mountains of Humboldt is not going to have the same environment as someone growing in the deserts of Nevada, for example. In any event, this is sort of a primer. I hope that you enjoyed this foray into the various terminologies related to integrated pest management. It is not exhaustive, but I would encourage you, if you are interested in these things, to follow Cheap Home Grow podcast, as well as my own YouTube channel, Zenthanol. Also, I am on Instagram as SyncAngel.